Three brief scenarios. 1. Suppose you have a married friend or relative who's developing a relationship with a person of the opposite sex. You're certain that your friend's spouse has no idea what's going on. What do you do? 2. Suppose your kids tell you about the behavior of some other kids at school, behavior you find very troubling. You tell your kids in no uncertain terms to stay clear of all of that. Is there anyone else you need to speak to? 3. Suppose a colleague is cutting corners at work for his own benefit and at the company's expense. Other folks are talking about this, but the boss doesn't have a clue. What do you do? A lot of folks, maybe even most of us, would hope not to find ourselves in any of these situations. Because if we do, we probably will find it a lot easier to talk about what's going on with any number of people, except for the very people who most need to hear from us, to be contacted, confronted, consulted. In our culture, one of the greatest taboos is judging or even appearing to judge the behavior of others. The conventional wisdom is to let everyone do what he or she wants, needs, or decides to do. And even if you disagree, even if you seriously disagree, it's best to keep your mouth shut because it's really none of your business. And you shouldn't interfere because you wouldn't want to appear to be judging anybody. Thank God, we all still have enough sense to intervene when we see someone step off the curb into the path of an oncoming vehicle. We reach out and pull them back. Just yesterday morning, Colin did that for me in Boston. But that may be an exception to the rule. If our reluctance to speak to our neighbor in terms of right and wrong and to warn each other of moral danger leaves us powerless in the face of potential harm. This kind of thinking colors our communal conscience as well, such that serious moral questions and decisions are put off, are deemed to be off limits, lest anyone feel judged on account of their actions. The scriptures today bring us within striking distance of looking at this cultural and personal phenomenon from a different perspective. In today's first reading, Ezekiel presumes a few things that our culture often denies. Namely, Ezekiel presumes that some things are right and some things are wrong, and that people do wrong things. And he teaches us that when we observe others doing wrong, we have an obligation to flag their errors. Because wrongdoing is never neutral. It's not just individual. It harms the wrongdoer and it harms others too. It harms the community. St. Paul comes at this from a different angle. He mentions the wrongs people do right out loud. He doesn't hold back, naming them: adultery, murder, theft, envy. But he concludes on a very positive note. Paul writes, "Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. If you love one another, you have fulfilled the entire law. Because love does no harm to the neighbor." My God, that's beautiful. In fact, it's almost too beautiful. But don't miss it. There it is, again, popping up in the middle of all that love talk from Paul. Love does no harm to the neighbor. Real love does not let the neighbor suffer any harm. Love will not allow the neighbor to be subject to harm. Love will be quick to pull your neighbor, your friend, your family member, your classmate, your colleague, to pull them out of harm's way, not just at the crosswalk, but in any place of danger, even and especially when the danger is subtle, moral, spiritual. In the gospel, Jesus proposes a fairly detailed protocol for dealing with others who are doing wrong. Jesus here is kind of the biblical prototype for the crisis intervention facilitator. He proposes 3 steps for intervention, and we cannot miss the import and the intimacy of the first step. He says, if your neighbor sins, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone, privately, discreetly, personally, charitably, lovingly. If that fails, then find a few others who love your neighbor enough to help pull him out of harm's way. Because love will not allow the neighbor to suffer any harm. The details, the steps of Jesus' protocol here for intervention, those details are less important than the underlying truth they presume and announce. That we have a responsibility to call each other out one-on-one, or with the help of a few others in our own circle. And not only just there, but in the community at large as well. Most of us don't have the authority or the position to do this. But it needs to be done when we see wrong being done, when we are witnesses to the injustice of prejudice, when we know what is true and know what is false, and have the insight, the power, and the opportunity to espouse the cause that is right. To do less than this is to fail in loving our neighbor, because love allows no harm to come to the neighbor. In fact, the most unloving thing of all, and therefore that thing which is to be most despised, is to pretend that everything is all right, nothing is wrong. Chance the consequences. To keep our mouths shut when love calls us to speak. To stand on the sidelines or in the parking lot or in the grocery store aisle, grousing and gossiping when love calls us to get into the game. To let anyone suffer the effects of wrongdoing when it's within our loving grasp to reach and pull our neighbor out of harm's way. Jesus was never reluctant to name wrongdoing when he encountered it. And Jesus never named a sin or a sinner without simultaneously offering an ocean of love and mercy to go with it, offered to the one who failed. By offering his life for us on the cross, Jesus opened wide his arms to reach out for you and me, because we have done nothing to deserve his embrace. We've done everything to merit his condemnation. And yet, even as he calls out our wrongdoing, he loves us with the whole of his being. Just so must be the ways in which we name right and wrong, and love one another deeply enough to keep each other from harm's way. We are, all of us here this morning, a church of sinners. We have all done wrong. And the scriptures call out our sins. And yet it's folks just like us whom Jesus invites to his altar to be forgiven, to be reconciled, to know his love and his mercy in the meal he shares with us at his table this morning. Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. For if you love one another, you have fulfilled every law, because love does no harm to the neighbor.